Coming up on the Sky News Daily with me, Tom Cheshire. Donald Trump has paused almost all foreign aid for 90 days. In South Africa, we ask what happens when AIDS relief stops.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kalnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100, every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Donald Trump is taking an axe to much of the US federal government, and he's swinging it with the help of the world's richest man, Elon Musk. That, though, will affect the world's poorest people because one of the programs being cut is USAID, the United States Agency for International Development. It has a budget of $50 billion, and it funds all sorts of programs all around the world. But the funding has been paused, and the effects of that are already being felt, especially in South Africa, which has the highest number of people living with HIV in the whole world, nearly 8 million people. We're going to be talking about that, and also what the pause means for American influence and geopolitical rivalries. And I'm joined by Yousra Elbagir, our Africa correspondent, who's in Johannesburg. Yousra, thanks for joining us. Now, Elon Musk says he's feeding USAID through the wood chipper, as he puts it, while the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says the programs offering life-saving assistance are exempt from the pause. What's the reality that you've seen in South Africa?
It's chaos here, Tom. I mean, even with that waiver, there's been a lack of communication. Two people here running projects that are included in that life-saving category that Rubio described. There's no doubt that if it's not that the funds have frozen and there's no money, that the confusion and the chaos of whether people should work, can work, is also causing the closure. HIV is still a massive issue here. South Africa still has one of the biggest HIV epidemics in the world. 8.5 million people living with HIV in South Africa don't know what's coming next, don't know if they'll be able to access their treatment next month. Go to clinics in town, in Johannesburg, finding them closed. One of the main clinics, Wits RHI, the Reproductive Health Institute of Wits University here, their clinics are shut down, and they put out a statement and said it's a direct result from the USAID orders funding freeze. Some of the most vulnerable people, they're now facing extreme uncertainty, and all of them consistently told us that they're worried they'll be plunged back into that catastrophe of AIDS and HIV here back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, speaking of that catastrophe in the early 2000s, and this is why the PEPFAR, which is the US President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that's why it was set up by George W. Bush, not, necessarily a liberal, though maybe these days he is regarded as a liberal in comparison to Trump. But the impact it had in South Africa in particular, and has continued to have over those years. Can you describe how important it has been?
I mean, South Africa is the largest recipient of PEPFAR funding. There are 5.9 million people here receiving ARVs, antiretroviral treatment, that are assisted by that funding, and $440 million was set aside to help South Africa through this year, October 2024 to September 2025. I mean, the South African government says that it is 17% of all HIV funding and support here. But I mean, a lot of people find that very difficult to believe. That is a statement that declares that South Africa has become self-sustaining in terms of its HIV and AIDS response. But just when you drive around and see these clinics shut and see that these clinics have been built on this funding, have been built on that stream of support coming in from the US. And these are the clinics that are targeting the most vulnerable people, that are research clinics, that are transgender clinics, that are clinics used by sex workers in town. I really feel like this is going to have a huge knock-on effect. Even if after the 90-day window, the funding is restored, even what's just happened in these 90 days of people not being able to access the testing, the PrEP, the prophylaxis treatment for them to not contract HIV after maybe being exposed. I would be very surprised if we didn't see some sort of uptick in numbers of people who contract HIV, because 3 months is a long time in big cities like Johannesburg, where there's a lot of people who are sexually active. But also, I think what PEPFAR did is that it created such relief, but it also sustained and propelled initiatives here in South Africa that were working to create that awareness, that were working to remove the stigma, that were all about treatment and action and campaigning.
How are they reacting? Are they sort of looking at the US administration, pointing fingers and asking why this is happening? Is it bewilderment? What are people thinking on the ground?
I mean, there's a lot of shock. It's quite a dizzying shock. I think the fact that that support permeates into people's everyday lives in ways that they may not even have known and are now having to face, I think creates this despair and disdain, not only with the US, but also towards the governments in their own country. So here in South Africa, there's been this building anti-Western sentiment, particularly anti-American sentiment, given the US support of Israel during the war in Gaza. And that's being obviously propelled by this chaos that is coming from America, but it's only confirming what people here already felt, that we are only supported by the US while we're useful to the US. I think the formula of Elon Musk and Donald Trump is so fascinating because you see it play out here where, you know, Elon Musk is probably the most embarrassing offshoot of post-apartheid South Africa, very much still far right, has that white supremacist leaning, is very kind of rash to dismiss the needs of the people, the power of the people, which is that kind of democratic South Africa is all about. There is a lot of embarrassment around him being a South African export. I was at a panel and I was sat next to Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Ressa, who does a lot of work on disinformation and social media. And she told a crowd of South Africans in Cape Town, she said, South Africa's given us Desmond Tutu, it's given us Nelson Mandela, but you've also given us Elon Musk. And there was this kind of grumble of like, yeah, in the audience of like sheepishness around the fact that all of these heroes and icons and liberation leaders and fighters and truth sayers that have come out of South Africa have now been offset by this one guy, Elon Musk.
Now, in terms of this foreign policy shift, Marco Rubio has said on X that he will not be attending the G20 summit, which is going to be in Johannesburg in November. He said this: South Africa is doing very bad things, expropriating private property, using G20 to promote, quote, solidarity, equality and sustainability, in other words, DEI and climate change. My job is to advance America's national interests, not waste taxpayer money or coddle anti-Americanism. Yousra, President Trump has said that USAID is run by radical lunatics, as he put it, and diversity, equity and inclusion, they've been a big focus of his administration so far. Do you think that is an accurate portrayal, though, of what it actually looks like on the ground?
I mean, PEPFAR is seen as one of the most successful foreign aid initiatives in the world, not just for the US, but in the world. But also there are, I'm sure, projects that USAID funds that could be better managed on the ground. But to completely wash away that kind of support, that kind of bridge building that the US has done through its USAID projects, is madness. It's chaos. I mean, I'm from Sudan and USAID is very much a part of a lot of initiatives there. I mean, as a young person who's educated, who wanted to stay in Sudan, you would join these initiatives. They'd get these funding from USAID, from the EU, and you'd be able to kind of help, you know, communities, but also get that training that you need. So I think that the reality is in Africa, foreign aid is so imbued into civil society. To just rip that away is going to cost millions of lives. There's no doubt about that. And when you look at the HIV crisis here in South Africa, I think that's the most visceral way I feel like I can see it have that immediate impact, where people are reliant on 3 months supply of ARVs, of treatment, and may not get even 1 month's supply and could die from AIDS.
We're going to take a short break and then we'll ask how Trump's pause on foreign aid has been received outside the West.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kellner.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.
Yousra, you mentioned that anti-Western sentiment in South Africa. And if you look at the sort of people who've welcomed this, you've got Dmitry Medvedev in Russia, advisor to Putin, saying this is a smart move. His words. Viktor Orban in Hungary saying that he welcomed the end to what he called globalist programs like this. Is this opening up a gap in American leadership and influence? USAID isn't just about charity. These are the goals of the US state.
100%. I mean, South Africa is a key player in BRICS. It came in, I think, a year after the other three countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. What's been happening, and South Africa is a key player in this, at the core of this, is this kind of multipolarity, wanting to move away from Western hegemony, wanting to kind of offset that reliance on the dollar. I mean, I think it would be very interesting. A friend actually told me this earlier. What if China stepped in to provide HIV support? I mean, that would be a massive coup. But those are the risks that they play into when they do things like this. They just strengthen the role of Russia and China in Africa and in Africa's wealthiest and most industrialized country, South Africa.
I mean, China's aid funding is tiny at the moment. I think it's $1 or $2 billion a year for a country that size. An economy that large, but also the fact that when it comes to that sort of influence, China tends to peddle infrastructure instead. Russia's offering especially military support in terms of mercenary groups around it. Whereas actually, if the US isn't providing this, China maybe won't. It's the people who rely on these programs, the people you've been speaking to, who will just be left behind.
I think that's the most likely scenario, that people will die waiting for someone to step in. I think in terms of that alternative, I absolutely agree with you. We usually see that in terms of the minerals deal in the DRC. That's where China could step in if the EU decides to pull out from its agreement with Rwanda. In terms of military support, Russia's obviously at the forefront of that. But I just think that gap is only going to strengthen ties between South Africa and China and Russia. It may not ever be about the people, but it will build that reliance on the alternative.
Do you think AIDS relief in Africa is going to continue after this 90-day pause?
One can only hope. I think it's really now on governments in Africa to find alternatives, because I don't think that the Trump administration can be relied upon to deliver on the promises of the past. And I think that's going to be South Africa's biggest challenge, is to assure people that they can continue to provide that support, because that fear and uncertainty, it may be directed at the US, but that's already a sunken ship in a lot of ways here. But it will be directed at the South African government. There will be frustration about why are we reliant on that amount of aid in the first place, and why have you left it this late to find a long-lasting solution?
And I suppose that's some of the conversation that Trump provides everywhere, right? Is that actually, why shouldn't countries be taking care of themselves, where it's European countries spending on defense? And they can argue, actually, countries do need to take care of themselves. And what we're doing is useful for them to do what they should be doing anyway.
I mean, I grew up on a whole criticism. I mean, Sudan, we were completely critical of the aid complex, the UN industrial kind of presence in Sudan. But the reality is, it's very easy for us in Khartoum, in the capital, the elite, to look down on those aid structures when there are people across these countries who are reliant on this support, who have completely built their lives around these initiatives, around this support. So as much as we can say, we're better off anyway, we need to become self-sustaining, we need to become independent, I don't think it's really up for anyone to say in some ivory tower who should rely on what. when these are the systems that have been in place and this is what people are banking on. And there's a reason for that. And there's a reason that our countries are underdeveloped. And until there is that sense of economic stability, and that includes health and infrastructure, then we can't just pull away that support. Because what we've seen, that flurry of panic, is going to continue. At least 900,000 patients with HIV in just 4 districts in South Africa have been directly impacted by the stop work orders. And they're suggesting that thousands of other people in other districts are affected as well. So this is around 1 million people with HIV affected here in South Africa in just the first month of the aid freeze. And then they're saying that thousands of others in other districts. This is a kind of a joint civil society letter, open letter to say we need this restored. These civil society groups, I'm sure many of them have their opinions about the US. I'm sure many of them have their opinions about foreign aid. But the reality is close to 1 million HIV patients are now affected, and that needs to be fixed as soon as possible. And then those kind of coping mechanisms and those alternative solutions can be thought of. But right now, it's crisis mode.
Yeah, as you say, the fire, the fury, all the bluster, but actually nearly 1 million people's lives at stake. It's a really good point, Yousra. Thank you for joining us on this.
Thanks, Tom.
That is all for The Daily. Remember, our US team are providing daily updates on the first 100 days of President Trump's second term in office. Search for Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back with The Daily tomorrow.
Donald Trump is heading back to the White House.
Together we can truly make America great again.
We are in for an unpredictable but fascinating 4 years.
And we're going to be following every twist and turn for the first 100 days. We'll be bringing you the latest updates and analysis first thing every morning. So join me, James Matthews.
Me, Martha Kalnick.
And me, Mark Stone.
For Trump 100 every weekday at 6 a.m, wherever you get your podcasts.